السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. حقوق الإنسان في الغرب، هل الحقيقة ترتقي إلى مستوى الخطاب؟ كل تلك المنظمات التي ترفع شعار العدالة الاجتماعية والعمل من أجل عالم أفضل وأكثر إنصافا، هل هي أجهزة العلاقات العامة لتعزيز أهداف السياسة الخارجية الغربية فقط؟ مع مؤسس شبكة القرن 21 للأخبار 21st Century Wire باتريك هينينغسون نستطلع تلك المنظمات والقوة الناعمة من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. لعل وسائل الإعلام الغربية والمسؤولون الحكوميون المحاصرون داخل بيئتهم الأيديولوجية الخاضعة للرقابة، حيث كل قرار هو أمر واقع افتراضي، سوف يرمون شباكهم بشكل روتيني إلى صناعة حقوق الإنسان من أجل توفير الدعم الأخلاقي الضروري لأي هدف في السياسة الخارجية. ويرى المراقبون أن هذه المقاربة تمارسها أيضاً الأمم المتحدة، التي كثيراً ما تستشهد بالإحصاءات والتقارير نفسها التي تستخدمها واشنطن لدعم خطوات سياستها الخارجية. هذه الحلقة المألوفة في الشؤون الدولية اليوم يفسرها ريك ستيرلينغ، الناشط المستقل في مجال حقوق الإنسان، كالتالي: هناك نمط من التقارير المثيرة بيد أنها غير صحيحة، ولكنها تؤدي إلى الاستحواذ على قبول الجمهور للتدخل العسكري الأمريكي والغربي في الدول في جميع أنحاء العالم، وكان هدفهم من خلال تلك التقارير التلاعب بالرأي العام، وقد نجحوا جميعا بطريقة أو بأخرى. وعلى الرغم من العواقب التي كانت في معظم الأحيان كارثية، لم يعاقب أي من مرتكبيها أو يدفع أي ثمن بحسب ستيرلينغ. المؤلف الأمريكي باتريك هينينغسون، مؤسس ومحرر الموقع الإلكتروني القرن 21 للأنباء والتحليلات، يحدثنا من الداخل عن واقع الجمعيات الخيرية المدافعة عن حقوق الإنسان، التي لا تزال تروج لنفسها على أنها محايدة أو غير تابعة. وهل أصبحت العديد من تلك المنظمات الريادية المتمركزة في أمريكا الشمالية وأوروبا انعكاسا لبرامج السياسات الخارجية الغربية، وبناء على ذلك أدوات للدعاية التدخلية؟ American author Patrick Henningsen, founder and editor of the news and analysis website 21st Century Wire. Welcome to من الداخل from the inside, Patrick.
It's great to be here.
It's great to have you, Patrick. Well, the 20th century saw a string of apparent failures by various governments to curb and hold some of the most horrific exhibitions of genocide and crimes against humanity. As a result to all this, the door was open for many high-profile charities and human rights organizations to play a bigger role in moderating international affairs. And you have written extensively about that, Patrick. Though many human rights charities still market themselves as neutral or non-partisan, the reality is something very different. What is the reality that you talked about?
Well, we see the trend in the international charities and NGOs. It's very much mirroring what's happened in local areas and countries. This is reflected internationally. Mm-hmm. And so in the local areas and countries, in Europe, for instance, this is being referred to as the new third sector, or the third way. So it's not public, it's not corporate, it's in the middle, it's NGO, it's charity. And so this has really proliferated over the last few years, and whereby in the past the person who was playing this role between the person maybe in the state, the people in the state, was the church or religious institutions. Now it's NGOs, it's charities. And so they're the sort of third rail, if you will. So in terms of international affairs, geopolitics, war, conflict, these charities have become big recognizable global brands, and they play a huge role in sort of managing the public perceptions around a whole number of issues. And the leading charities in this department, I would say, that are recognizable to most people are Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are two good examples, although there are many others. But they play not just a role in doing charity work as maybe they were formed to do way back in the early days of their organization. Now they play a public relations role in helping to support the foreign policies of countries like the United States, or to support the talking points run by the U.S. State Department or the British Foreign Office. I'll give you an example. Syria is obviously a live test tube for this sort of activity, and if you look at early on from the conflict in 2011, the person who was really running point on this is the director of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, okay, tweeting over and over about Assad's barrel bombs, crimes against humanity, war crimes, etc. And in many cases, the information coming out of these organizations and their leaders is often inaccurate, is disinformation in some cases. The problem is people trust these brands. They have celebrity sponsors. They have people from Hollywood who are their patrons, if you will, like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. So the public in general in the West trust these brands, and there's no reason why they shouldn't in their mind, because they have this immaculate track record in terms of public relations. But what's happening is these organizations are very subtly steering public opinion towards intervention or a humanitarian intervention, as was the case with Syria. And so there's calls for a no-fly zone, and of course these types of organizations are leading the way. Amnesty International was running a PR campaign in parallel with the NATO summit in Chicago. I think it was in 2012. And they're saying, they ran a billboard campaign in this part of Illinois, in Chicago, saying, keep the progress going, NATO. And so what they're saying is, because of women's rights issues, NATO needs to be occupying militarily Afghanistan to keep the women
to emancipate the women.
Emancipate the women. So it was the first feminist war in history, really, the way it was marketed. But the director at the time of Amnesty International America came directly out of the U.S. State Department the year before. And so you see the revolving door between government, these charities, organizations like NATO, even Javier Solano, who was in charge of NATO European forces during part of the Yugoslavian war, I believe sitting on the board.
EU foreign policy envoy.
Yeah, and he's, I believe, sitting on the board possibly of Human Rights Watch, I'm pretty sure. So, but that's just one example. So you have military people involved in these organizations.
But you know, this is a very dangerous thing, you know, with public skepticism of the charity sector already at an all-time high. The danger here is clear. Don't you think that this would threaten to undermine the credibility of the entire NGO sector?
Yeah, and that is
internationally.
That's the danger. And so I think they've used and abused these organizations' public confidence to such a degree, using it to promote military intervention in many cases. Okay, so Syria is a great example of this. One of the NGOs that's become world famous from the Syrian conflict is an NGO called the White Helmets. Okay, and so one of my colleagues, Vanessa Bealey, has done an extensive amount of research on this, and in fact has gone to Syria, and I've accompanied her on this recent trip to go and visit the White Helmets facilities to find out, you know, what exactly is this organization. If you live in America, they provide a huge percentage of the video footage that American audiences will see on CNN, on NBC, is from this so-called NGO called the White Helmets, who call themselves Syria's Civil Defense. And they're funded, they got $23 million from the USAID, the State Department. They got another $64 million from the British Foreign Office. There's quite a few undisclosed sums from a number of different EU-related programs and countries. Netherlands, France, Germany, everyone seems to have chipped in to this pot that is probably nearly $200 million, possibly more, if you count crowdfunding. And what are they doing with this money? And it seems to me that, and it seems to many others, that they're producing a lot of films. And these films are really used to back the foreign policy directives of the NATO member states with regards to Syria and the Gulf countries.
And their rhetoric, of course.
Yeah.
Right. But here, I need to understand more. Does the reality live up to the rhetoric in the West?
In terms of charities?
In terms of human rights organizations.
In human rights organizations, I think, sadly, I don't think it lives up to the rhetoric anymore. And partly is because these organizations have become so politicized, and they become tools, really, of military operations.
So they started from the very beginning, Patrick, for that ultimate aim.
Well, I don't know for sure, but that's what it's become. And some of these organizations may have set up themselves with very good intentions and with ambitions to do great things in the world, but over the decades, they've been co-opted, they've been corporatized. Money, with a lot of the charity sectors, making money is their #1 priority, fundraising. Directors are getting paid millions of dollars. Board members are getting paid huge sums of money to come to a handful of meetings a year. And this is where people's donations are going. But they're using these organizations to launder. It's called conscious laundering, or they call it the wrong kind of green, some people call it, which is to launder. So in other words, it's like paying your guilt tax. You make a corporate donation or something to a charity like this, and everyone's happy. It's kind of an industry that scratches its own back.
Right.
And from this, most people don't want to engage with any problems that might be surrounding these, because everyone said, just leave it alone, leave the charities alone, they're okay. But really they're not when they're advocating for no-fly zones, for instance, in Syria or Libya. Libya is a great example.
Exactly.
There's a whole string of lies.
It's because of the human rights issue, look what happened to Libya.
Look what happened to Libya, and my former national security advisor, Susan Rice, saying on national TV, world television, that Gaddafi was distributing Viagra to his soldiers to commit mass rape. Okay, a ridiculous story, and yet that story cascaded and made
sold.
And it sold to the human rights crowd, the donors of Amnesty, the people who pledge monthly sums from their wages into a direct debit bank deposit to fund Human Rights Watch because they support that issue.
Yeah, right. Patrick, allow us to stop for a short break and then we'll continue this very interesting discussion. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا.
الكاتبة ستيفاني ماكميلان تصف الدور الجديد للمنظمات غير الحكومية في القرن الحادي والعشرين قائلة: إلى جانب الاجتياحات العسكرية والتبشيرية، فإن المنظمات غير الحكومية تساعد على استباحة حرمة الدول، ممهدة الطريق لأمواج من الاستغلال والاجتثاث. المؤلف الأمريكي باتريك هينينغسون، مؤسس ومحرر الموقع الإلكتروني القرن الحادي والعشرين للأنباء والتحليلات، برأيه هل أصبحت العديد من منظمات حقوق الإنسان الريادية المتمركزة في أمريكا الشمالية وأوروبا انعكاسا لبرامج السياسات الخارجية الغربية، وبناء على ذلك أدوات للدعاية التدخلية؟
Sure. We see this pattern in many, many different places. I'll give you another good example. We talked about Syria, we talked about Libya, we talked about Afghanistan. These are all basically countries that have been conquests, if you will, of Western powers. What about Sudan? So most recently there's anti-corruption campaign to stop corruption in South Sudan. And before that it was Darfur. And so that is a country that has absolutely been cracked open by Western powers, and this is probably by anyone's estimation a result of, while the U.S. was busy in the Middle East over the last 15 or 20 years, China was busy making inroads, economic inroads into Africa, and especially Sudan. And so by partitioning Sudan, this was a great achievement for the United States, for one, okay? So to do that, you needed to create international outrage, and they're still doing it with South Sudan. These corruption campaigns led by George Clooney, anti-corruption campaigns. We must save the people of South Sudan from the corrupt governments, when in fact you could argue that it is partly because of the clandestine efforts of major powers that caused the so-called civil war in Sudan to begin with. You can make an argument on this basis.
Right. Now, to add also, in recent years, Patrick, under the banner of human rights, the U.S. has developed some new and innovative methods of intelligence gathering and achieving an increased military footprint in new countries. To reach these objectives, Western governments enlist change agents, what they term them as change agents, which is the charities and aid organizations and even religious missionary organizations. So there is a type of government, media, human rights, industrial complex. How does this apply in Syria? How does this manifest itself in Syria? You talked about the white helmets, but other things too.
Yeah, I mean, the white helmets are a great definition of a Western change agent. And it's not so much that they're doing any change in Syria, but what they are doing is what they're producing in terms of material, in terms of propaganda for Western audiences, is changing public opinion in the West, whereby the media will cover an issue a certain way, and they will put pressure on the government to act, to intervene. A good example of this is in Uganda. In 2012, there was a campaign by a charity called Invisible Children based in San Diego. It was called Kony 2012. We must find Joseph Kony because he's impressing child soldiers, and we need to stop this, and we need Obama's help to do it. So they raised millions and millions of dollars, made expensive films, and in the end, they lobbied the president, and the U.S. deployed 200 special forces to Uganda, supposedly to find Kony.
Who might be dead.
Who has been dead maybe by anyone's guess since 2006, or no one's seen him actually since 2006. But it doesn't matter because the public opinion storm had already begun. And so they had children, schools were enlisted, teachers were getting kids to put their money in for this. And it turned out this charity collapsed. Partly because the allegations that this was some kind of a scam.
But it helped set the scene for those 200 special forces to come to this place, to this country.
Exactly, and that was a United States realizing a goal of U.S. AFRICOM, which is U.S. Command and Control of Africa, which by coincidentally wanted a base on African soil, and Muammar Gaddafi was one of the only African leaders that vetoed that, so they had to put the base in Stuttgart, Germany. And only 2 years later, you know what happened to Gaddafi 2 years after that. So, but AFRICOM is a massive project that was put online in 2007 at the end of the George Bush presidency. But Obama was the president that made AFRICOM very successful. There's very little resistance to. The U.S. are now have a military footprint on at least 43 different countries in Africa. Before George Bush, I don't believe maybe 1 or 2 countries they had a military footprint on. Very successful.
How does this subtle yet relentless Western campaign of disinformation feed neatly into the Western policy of regime change embodied in the rhetorical demand that, for example, Assad must go, you know, vis-a-vis Syria?
So the whole basis of sanctions on Syria, and they were just renewed last week by President Trump. The whole basis of sanctions on Syria is war crimes. Whose war crimes? Well, apparently, the war crimes of Bashar al-Assad. And this is based on what? This is the question no one wants to ask, because the narrative is moving so quickly, and it's Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, all these charities, Avaz.org.
Avaz, yeah, Avaz. You know, Avaz, the main purpose of Avaz is, you know, to change you know, the mindset of the people.
They're a change agent. So what they're doing is they're creating what they call stakeholders in the world of the third sector. A stakeholder is someone who has a stake in the issue. So when you sign a petition, effectively you're a level of a stakeholder according to this. So you've engaged in some process. And that process is you've effectively voted for a certain thing or a certain policy. Oz was campaigning for no-fly zones and using white helmet type imagery to do that. And very successfully, millions and millions of people signed on to that. And they think, well, Assad must be an evil guy. Why would everyone be putting all this effort in, all these petitions, all of this humanitarian work and campaigning if it wasn't true? How could it not be true? And when you look at the charges that really come down to barrel bombs. Assad's dropping barrel bombs. He's killing his own people.
Here, I want you to elaborate a bit on the use of language. They create like defectors, like, you know.
Early on, defectors, that was a big one. Yeah.
Yes. So tell me about the use of language and this, you know, to create this rhetoric.
Yeah, in this way, the language is very important. And in the media,
not to talk about the film industry, of course.
Yeah, the language is, you could say, weaponized. This is a term a lot of people use these days, weaponized, but it is in a way. And if you look at
the defectors, detainees, activists, journalists, you know.
Yeah, and that's very important. So the military used to do this work. It was called forward operations or information warfare. And this used to be done by the military, but the military doesn't need to do this anymore when they're going to soften up a target country. The charities will do it for them. The human rights groups will do it for them. It will happen on social media. And people in their countries might start seeing all this stuff, and a whole revolution's created online on Twitter. But when you go to the ground, like some reporters I spoke to who went to Iran in 2009, they were looking for the green revolution. They couldn't find it. But they were looking on Twitter and it was like it was everywhere. But in reality it wasn't. And so this is the reality that we live in. And so the language is very important. Activist journalists, who are they? They're providing CNN, the BBC, Al Jazeera with 100% of all of their reporting and information coming out of Aleppo, for instance. So the rhetoric and the language says to the Western audience that the whole city of Aleppo was under siege. And they were under siege by the Russians and the evil Assad. The reality was that the majority of people were in a government-protected west side of Aleppo.
Right. And they are also reporting to the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights. Many thanks indeed, Patrick, for this intensive, in-depth discussion. American author and founder and editor of the news and analysis website 21st Century Wire, Bاتريك هينينغسون. Always welcome to الميادين أنتم من الداخل.
Thank you.
You're always welcome, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد بقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك. من الداخل من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.